My first major psychic experience as a child was in the form of a vision, and its impression remains as vivid today as it was then at the age of 7. It occurred to me about 8 o'clock on a sunny May morning when my sister Dolly and I were getting dressed, ready to set off for our daily lessons at the local school. I had a mass of thick black hair, and I was standing before a mirror in front of a window, endeavouring to arrange it, when I became aware of a movement beyond the window. Looking up, I saw a dazzling vision of a knight in shining armour, poised in the sky, of majestic life-size proportions. He was encased from head to foot in armour. Each leg was sheathed in steel plate, running right down to his feet and ending in points at the toes. His body was clad in chainmail, on the front of which was a blazing red cross. On his head was a helmet, and though his face was covered by a visor, I could see a pair of piercing eyes shining through the eye slits. At the back of his helmet he wore a crest, which I could not see sufficiently well to describe, and in front of him he held a two-handed sword pointing to the sky. His right hand grasped the hilt, which was studded with gems, while his left hand gripped his right wrist in support. On his hands were gauntlets. The whole figure, and particularly the sword, glinted dazzlingly like sunlight reflected by snow. And from that moment onwards, I have always thought of him as my white knight. As I watched him, he slowly lowered the blade of the sword and extended the point towards me, as though in salute. This action must have released powerful vibrations towards my body, for I suddenly felt myself go weak at the knees, and my stomach seemed to turn over. The vision persisted. 3 times I glanced away, to find it still there when I looked back. Then I called to my sister, "Dolly, come and look." Dolly looked, and a moment later, to my horror, she had collapsed in a faint. The vision then disappeared as mysteriously as it had come. Alarmed by my Dolly's fainting fit, I called out to my parents, who rushed in and bore my sister away. When she had recovered sufficiently, my father questioned her, in the course of which she described the figure exactly as I had seen it. And it made a great impression on me, because this was the first time any member of my family had seen or heard any of the spirit people I knew so well. My poor parents were most disturbed and puzzled by the occurrence, particularly as I had no opportunity of talking to my sister and exchanging impressions with her before my father questioned her. I have seen my white knight only once since then. This was years later, on the occasion of my first meeting at the Queen's Hall in London. Not unnaturally, I was somewhat nervous at the prospect of addressing my first meeting. But as I stood up to speak, I suddenly saw him suspended above the audience. Again he lowered his sword and pointed it at me, causing me to shake violently, as though the rays of the sword were disintegrating my body by the strength of their vibrations. Shaw Desmond, the distinguished writer, was on the platform with me, unaware of what was happening. I asked anxiously if I was ill. I shook my head and stood waiting, wondering whether I should hear my knight's voice. Then came no sound, but unbidden into my mind came words. To serve and not to yield. I knew they had come from him. A medium taking her place on a public platform relies entirely upon her spirit friends, for without them she can do nothing. It is only at that ultimate moment before addressing her audience that she becomes aware whether or not her gift will manifest itself. No dress rehearsal, no prompter in the wings can help her. She stands alone, save only for her spirit communicators. And this was the first time I had been called upon to take the platform at the Queen's Hall. It was the beginning of an important series of fortnightly meetings, and a most significant moment in my career. There can be no other explanation than that the night had come to show me I was not alone in my mission to spread the truth of survival after death, that the blazing red cross on his breast was symbolical of the crusade upon which I was setting out. I had an ordinary schooling in the local council school, which I left at the age of 14. I had continued without a break to meet my spirit people. They now started to warn me of events which afterwards came to pass. At such moments I would receive intensely strong impressions about future happenings, accompanied by the certain knowledge of how they would work out. One day, shortly after my father's death, some years later, he returned in spirit form to my mother's house. I can see him now, standing at the top of the stairs and speaking words which filled me with alarm. "My dear," he said, "I'm worried about Bella." Bella was my sister, and for the next 2 or 3 days I hugged my father's words secretly to myself in a fever of worry and anxiety. On the 4th day, the blow fell. Bella became ill, very ill, and for a time I was certain that her last earthly hours had come. Then, to my intense relief, she slowly began to recover and eventually was quite well again. It was natural that my father should have been concerned for Bella's well-being. It was no less natural, having regard for my tender age and the circumstances of my father's visit to me, that I should put the blackest, most dread interpretation on his words, and as a result, I suffered needless agonies of suspense. It seemed to me that there was a moral to be drawn from this experience, and that was there a lesson to be learned. That, at least, was how I looked at it. As a consequence, from that day to this, I have always guarded carefully against the slightest tendency to read more into the words which come to me from my voices than is intended, or indeed is strictly there. At 15, I went to work as a nursemaid to a family in Turnham Green. I loved children, and here there were 3 of them to look after. They occupied nearly all my time for the next 3 years. Then I met and married Hugh Warren Miles. Hugh was born at Cumberland Lodge, Windsor Park, and had received his education as a Blue Coat boy at Christ's Hospital. His stepmother, whose maiden name was Evelyn Galt, was a sister of the wife of the President Wilson. He had a kind and sympathetic nature, and we were as happy as any 2 young people can be. It was a great joy to be with someone whom I could talk freely about my spirit people, someone who listened and understood. One such occasion was on the morning when I woke up and told him I had seen his Aunt Mary walk through our bedroom during the night. I had never actually met this aunt, yet somehow I knew intuitively that the figure I had seen had been she. We learned later that she had died that night. In due course, I found that I again had 3 children to look after, but this time they were mine. We were getting by only with difficulty on my husband's meagre wages as a clerk. Hugh was the most generous of men, with the softest of hearts. One day, as he was walking home at the end of a week's work, he was so touched by a tale of woe told him by a poor man, he gave away his entire week's wages. Imagine my feelings when I had no money with which to buy food for our own children. 8 years after we were married, Hugh fell ill. It was thought at first that he was suffering from consumption. Sir William Fairbanks, physician to the royal family, who was a friend of my husband's family, arranged for him to be examined at Brompton Hospital. The diagnosis revealed that he was suffering from Bright's disease. He was never able to work regularly again, although he tried hard to do so. I had to be the breadwinner. With an invalid husband and 3 children to maintain, our meagre sickness allowance of 10 shillings a week was woefully inadequate. I found employment doing housework from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon at a nursing home in Twickenham. The pay was small and insufficient for our needs, but enabled us to keep going, even though I had many a time to go without meals in order to feed my little ones. Clothes were an even greater difficulty, and the only solution to the shoe problem I could find was to stuff the soles with newspaper. It was not very effective in wet weather. End of part 2.